While this is usually a channel based on lore and talking about the writing in games, something has been bothering me about the Mega Man franchise as a whole. Tradition. Well, let's call it what they truly are, formulas. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with formulas. In fact, they're typically a good thing. They often incorporate defining traits of a good video game, particularly those in franchises. But what are defining traits can often be shackles that hold back a series from evolving. And that lack of evolution leads to stagnation. Yet we hardly acknowledge this in the fanbase. This is mainly because we just so happen to like the games, but another reason is because the games are designed to be pretty short with a high skill ceiling, providing replay value where improvement is encouraged. So familiarity ends up being a huge plus, as our skill transfers from one game to the next. However, history has proven to us that this method doesn't exactly work, especially with how Capcom went about it. Now, to be fair, this wasn't a problem exclusive to Mega Man. Chances are, if it's a long-running franchise and not named Final Fantasy, it probably had a period of stagnation. However, Mega Man is the poster child to this in the video game industry. To fully understand this, let's go back to the near beginning of this franchise's popularity. While Mega Man 1 did lukewarm to the public, Mega Man 2 improved heavily on the formula and became a great success. Now that Capcom had a formula that worked, teams were made to constantly produce Mega Man games. Problem is, none of them ever did as well as Mega Man 2. Now, there are many reasons for this, but one of them is absolutely because of its lack of innovation. A game reviewer for the GamePro magazine in 1993 even went as far as to say,
Capcom must get some kind of cash rebate for recycling video games.
Capcom took this criticism to heart and decided to do something different. Through that, Mega Man X was born, and the first game of the series ended up being one of the most well-received games of all time. Even to this day, people still see this game as a genuine masterpiece, and the game is close enough to its predecessor that it feels like a natural evolution to the series. Mega Man X would then become the most prolific series in the franchise until Battle Network. However, Capcom decided to continue the classic series with middling success. Now, why continue the classic series when you can put more time and resources in what proved to be the better received game? So, there isn't a direct answer to this, but I can make a pretty good guess. Thanks to an interview with Kazuhiro Tsuchiya, we know there was an expectation within Capcom to release a Mega Man game once every year. In order to keep this up, the development cycles couldn't hit any snags. So as Mega Man X got more and more ambitious with its production cycle, other teams had to pick up the slack to meet the yearly deadline. This is primarily why we got Mega Man 7 on a Super Nintendo, even though the Mega Man X series was a standard, as X3 was outsourced and put in development hell. In other words, the classic series continued on to allow the X series to have more production time. Now, I have to stress this is just an estimated guess. Though, if you look at the production history within the Mega Man franchise, it lines up, especially once Legends and Battle Network came to fruition. Now, this is a tangent, but bear with me. Back in the day when I was 6, there was a rental store nearby that my parents and I went to get things for the week. For me, on that day, I got Mega Man 7. And I remember thinking, wow, I didn't know Mega Man X had a bunch of different games I never heard about. That's pretty cool. So I went back home and played the intro stage. And then I realized there is no X in this Mega Man game. Realizing I had the wrong series, I went ahead and promptly returned it. Now, as an adult, Mega Man 7 is one of my favorite games in the series. However, as a kid that only loved X1, X2, and X3, it was pretty jarring, and I felt pretty disappointed on how stripped down the classic series felt and compared to the X series. Now, while I don't believe I am in the majority of this, I do think that this was a pretty big factor when it came to the lackluster reception from the public. All of this to say, it's rare to find someone sticking to just the Mega Man franchise and nothing else. Yearly releases of Mega Man are great, but a lot of them aren't the same series or even the same standards of gameplay. There's Classic, X, Zero, ZX, Battle Network, Star Force, and Legend. Many people would argue that ZX should be attached to the Zero series and Star Force should be attached to the Battle Network. If we do that, that means we have 5 separate series within the Mega Man franchise. While the X series would have a unique problem, which we'll get into, the other series have the issue of you played one, you played them all. Again, it's a pretty hard sell to constantly buy full price games without being a die-hard fan. Why would you pay full price for a game to provide you an experience you already achieved? Furthermore, what's often the nail in the coffin for most of these games is when you strike gold with their particular entry. The goal after that is to perform better than that entry, and the games often fail to do so. In Classic it was Mega Man 2, and Battle Network it was Battle Network 3. In Zero it's Zero 3, and in Legends, well, that series didn't last long enough to get to that problem. So one would argue, what makes a franchise not stagnate? Well, to answer that, let's look at 3 long-running successful franchises: Mario, Resident Evil, and Pokemon. Mario is somewhat of a special case because he's one of, if not the most recognizable icon worldwide, and that's no exaggeration. Not only did the franchise literally save video gaming back in the 1980s, but the games often defined new trends and standards for the gaming industry. The Mario franchise is essentially the pioneer of gaming, and the master of innovation and evolution. This is because Mario's gameplay as a concept is extremely simple. You just run and jump. It's thanks to that simplicity that you can do a lot with it. Super Mario Bros. Defined platforming. Super Mario World redefined platforming by just adding more options, including near infinite flight. Mario 64 literally defined full 3D exploration with concepts used in 3D games to this day. And Mario Odyssey set the modern standard for collectathons, providing absolutely insane speedrunning tricks. Resident Evil has a different approach. It initially defined the survival horror genre, but eventually became compelling for its focus on a well-crafted cinematic experience, and a strong cast of characters that the fanbase wants to follow to the end. By the time Resident Evil 4 came around, it redefined third-person shooters with its over-the-shoulder camera and gameplay. While people would say Resident Evil started to falter with 5 and 6 for being over-the-top and straight from the survival genre, many would argue those games were still fun for what they are. It's unanimous though that Resident Evil 7, Village, and the remakes got the series back on track and rekindled the survival horror while also keeping its fun gameplay as a shooter. Pokemon is in a unique position. Many would argue, myself included, that Pokemon hasn't changed since its debut. While players are beginning to openly complain about stagnation now, I'm still including it because it took over 2 decades to reach that point. Pokemon is in a state where it just outright dominates its own genre. It's not even funny how gargantuan it is. It's not the story that makes it good, or even the gameplay really. It's the fact that there's no real competition to its media empire. The Pokemon games in and of themselves are extremely simple, but it's that simplicity that makes it easily accessible to newcomers to keep that well-oiled machine going. It's not just a franchise, and that cannot be emphasized enough. So within these 3 franchises, there's one commonality behind all of them. They're trendsetters. Mario defined platformers, Resident Evil defined survival shooters, and Pokemon defined, well, Pokemon. And this is the case for most long-running franchises as well, including but not limited to Zelda, Halo, Metroid, and even Mega Man itself. Which leads into why Mega Man X and Battle Network were so important, because these also fit their criteria perfectly. For a long time, there was nothing really like Battle Network's gameplay. It is easily the biggest reason why that series sold so well. That and its extremely good marketing. Mega Man X was in the same boat. You can find a ton of clones or deviations of classic Mega Man's gameplay, but even to this day, you would be hard-pressed to find a game that has the tight mechanics and fluidity of the X series. Now we had 2 series that had 2 different game plans. While the Battle Network series was unapologetically lacking in innovation, the X series constantly tried to freshen things up with each new entry. So why did both of these series ultimately fail? So technically, Battle Network didn't actually fail. While the sales were beginning to dwindle upon its final entry, it managed to end before they truly felt the after effects. But its successor, Star Force, would really be dealt a bad hand for taking all of Battle Network's criticisms and eventually be canned. Despite Star Force actually changing how the game was played, the similarities were too close and the people who were starting to burn out on Battle Network began checking out. This began to settle in with Capcom when Operation Shooting Star, a remake of Battle Network 1, failed to reach sales numbers familiar to the original series. Mega Man X actually innovated a good deal. I would say it's the only series that defined itself for its innovation. Each entry would add gimmicks and refine its gameplay, with many stating that X4 was the perfection of that formula. While I disagree with that statement, it's hard to argue that the addition of a second character with an entirely new approach to the gameplay was a bad thing. However, these pushes for innovation would eventually lead to X7, which is easily the worst major release in the entire franchise. It's not necessarily because it changed so much. After all, X7 was a response to fans and critics alike, criticizing the X series for not going into 3D while all other major franchises were well into their 3D journeys. It didn't matter Capcom already did it with Legends. Legends is not Mega Man X. To put it simply, the major reason X7 failed is because the series went through a lot of changes and all those changes were really fucking bad. Capcom was not ready to push Mega Man X's formula and gameplay into 3D, and it just clearly showed. While X5 and X6 had lukewarm reception at best, X7 single-handedly took the X series off the map. In both cases, there is emphasis on a lack of evolution, eventually leading to their downfall. Battle Network is a classic case of milking out a formula until exhaustion. Some may think, why does it matter when Pokemon does the same thing and they get praised for it? The answer to that is, Pokemon is more the exception to the rule. Pokemon is an entire culture, with anime, trading cards, a competitive experience, and so much merchandise and a robust community. Believe it or not, the Pokemon games make up a small fraction of the fan base, despite being the lifeblood of the series. Game Freak's job with Pokemon is to pump out as many new Pokemon as possible to keep its media empire running. So the Pokemon games themselves sorta have their hands tied when it comes to doing something new. Battle Network was not at that point, despite it being a potential contender to having a piece of Pokemon's pie. But the fact is, Battle Network wouldn't be able to sustain itself through chip collection or anything of that sort. After all, they're just weapons. PvP was its only culture it could cultivate. But thanks to the lack of online play on the GBA, this couldn't really be capitalized on until much later after the Battle Network series ended through some really dedicated fans. All this to say, if Capcom really wanted to, they could have leaned in much harder to the PvP aspect of Battle Network when the DS came out and take advantage of the online play. Battle Network didn't need to change the gameplay to level things up. It just needed to stop playing it safe for 6 games in a row and capitalize on what made it unique. Now, some of you may be confused that I say Mega Man X failed to evolve, when the first game is an evolution of the classic series. Therein lies the rub though. It's only for the first game. Every subsequent game after that did not evolve beyond that. If we go back to Mario, the difference between Super Mario World and Super Mario Odyssey is massive. Odyssey is way more complex with a much larger moveset, but many would tell you the games still feel and play fundamentally like Mario. Again, the X series was the most prolific of the franchise, and the only one of its kind. So it was deeply aggravating that Mega Man X kept shying away from making the jump to 3D. But Capcom didn't care for this until they started noticing that the games weren't selling as well. So the jump to 3D was entirely reactionary. Ultimately, Mega Man X7 didn't feel like a 3D game. There's a third axis, sure, but it essentially plays like a 2D Mega Man X game, just like its predecessors. And it doesn't take advantage at all of the extra dimension. It also just happened to be really bad. And before we move on from this topic, Mega Man X absolutely can work in a 3D plane, and it doesn't need to be a terrible FPS clone to do it. It would just take some real time, effort, and some imagination. Change is a scary thing, and people don't like it. But at the same time, people don't like things to stay the same either. It's important to acknowledge that Mega Man was once a trendsetter and defined the action platforming genre. And while the franchise as a whole remained consistently good, it tried to ignore that gaming has changed and it has fallen from the eyes of the public because of it. If we want Mega Man to return to relevance in modern gaming, We as a fanbase have to understand that Mega Man as a series can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. Change must happen, and risks must be taken. To close this, I will leave you with this quote from Shigeru Miyamoto. "I made some games, but I'm pretending like I didn't, because they all turned out weird." Thanks for watching.